Good afternoon. This is Mikhail Tank with KPFK in Sicily at a very special museum with editor, author, Jungian historian, and professor Sonu Shamdasani. Hello, Sonu.
Good morning.
It's been a really fantastic conference here. What are your feelings so far, and how have you enjoyed it?
I've enjoyed what I've heard in the main.
Your presentation yesterday was really extraordinary. Can you please tell our listeners a little bit about the subject and what you discussed?
Thank you. My subject was the relation between attempting to situate Jung's pictorial work within a number of the artistic movements and developments, and as well as works being done in psychiatry and psychology in terms of attempting to understand the psychology and pathology of creative expression. And I was trying to look at the relation between Jung's attitude to modern art, his criticisms of art, his understanding of the true functions of art in relation to his own activity.
And what is the main goal or statement that you had to say?
I'm not sure I had a main goal or statement, but it was attempting to write or present a series of intersections and divergences in the sense that the main, you could say, point that I ended with was to indicate that there's a certain paradox that if you take on board Jung's own criteria of what art should be, paradoxically his own symbolic expressions really fulfill those criteria.
You are currently working on Jung's Black Books. What can you tell us about that, and when is the possible release date?
I can't say anything about that now, apart from saying that what the Black Books are is that journals in which he noted his self-experimentation from 1913 to 32. So the Red Book was composed of active imaginations first written in the Black Books between 1913 and 1916, and they continue thereafter. So the Black Books presents both the prime material out of which Jung developed the Red Book and also its further continuation, which also further illuminates the paintings that he eventually included in the Black Books.
Do we know approximately the volumes or the release date, or is that not available?
It hasn't been determined yet.
Got it. The Red Book was released, was it 2009 or 2010?
2009.
And I remember going to the Hammer Museum and seeing it in person. I actually also added it to my show for the special ones in Hollywood. The book is so beautiful. It is so exquisite, and it is perhaps arguably the most important recent Jungian book published in the past several decades. This is all mostly due to you. So I think a lot of people in the Jungian community look up to you tremendously, partially due to the Red Book. If you can please describe the process, how long it took you, and how do you feel about it?
The process took several stages. First was the issue of initial research and discussion over about a period of 3 years with the heirs of Jung of whether or not to release it for publication. And it was decided in 2000, on the basis of proposals I'd submitted, that it would indeed be released for publication. And the main editing phase was from about 2000 to 2004. Following that, there were somewhat protracted issues vis-a-vis finding an appropriate publisher of the work. So it was a long journey.
The book, there's two versions of the book. There's the large hardcover, which is a very gigantic, beautiful book, and then there's a short version with a lot of the writing. They come hand in hand, correct?
Yes, I mean, part of the thinking of, you could say, the smaller edition as compared to the facsimile edition, which discussed on numerous occasions with the editor at Norton responsible for the whole project, Jim Mars, was that instead of doing what I would say many publishers would have done, which was to have produced an edition on a smaller scale, say at A4 or with various images on one page, it preserved the integrity of the facsimile edition and presented a text-only edition, which is also provides an easy way of reading the two works in conjunction. How you can keep the facsimile edition open on the plates whilst following the text in the reader's edition.
Is there anything omitted from the Red Book that was in the original?
No. Oh, actually, in the facsimile edition, there were 400 blank pages. So the size of the original calligraphic volume is about 600 pages, of which 400 were blank, but all of the pages on which Jung wrote and painted are presented on a 1-to-1 scale.
Were they blank in the back and the front throughout? And do we know if perhaps there was any kind of invisible ink used?
There's no invisible ink used. They were blank at the back, and the transcription is left off mid-sentence, so the transcription was unfinished. It's not clear how much further you intended to transcribe, i.e., if you just intended to transcribe to the end of Liber Secundus, or if you intended to continue right through the third section, scrutinies. Those are unknown questions.
And the other question I have about that is the Red Book, is there another volume of it available, or is that going to be part of the Black Books? Are there any other additions to the Red Book that will be published in the future?
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
Okay. The next subject is the book Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. I read your essay, which discussed many omissions, and I was wondering, you did get a chance to see the original manuscript in the library, correct?
The protocols of Jung's interviews with Agnello Jaffe are on open access in the Library of Congress, so that anyone can go there and read them. And there are other manuscripts, such as the first 3 chapters that Jung wrote the initial version of, available on access at the archives at the Swiss Institute of Technology in Zurich.
And altogether, the published version that we're all aware of Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, what grade would you give that book? And if you could, at this point, would you republish the original version?
I think that for any understanding of what Jung was saying, one has to go back to the manuscripts. So they're there, and let's say they're available for anyone to read. The issue with the published text is that it was subjected to multiple editing by many hands, by the editors, by basically anyone who was involved. I think it's fair enough to say it was a case of too many cooks spoil the broth, and that Jung never read the final manuscript. There was editing done subsequent to his death, so he didn't approve the volume that's on the shelf, and rather there are indications that he had severe misgivings about the versions of the manuscripts that he did see, as he complained to Richard Hull that it turned him into an old aunt.
You're currently a professor at the college in London.
At University College London, yes.
Can you describe your position there, and also how you relate with the Jung family at this time?
I hold the Philemon Chair in Jung history, and I've been engaged in the broader discipline of the history of psychology and psychiatry. And the bulk of my time there was at the former Wellcome Trust Center for the History of a Center for the History of Psychological Disciplines, which is now merging and expanding into a Center for Health Humanities, which I co-direct with my colleague James Wilson, which is establishing a master's program in health humanities, which will be starting next year. So I supervise a broad range of PhDs in the field of history of the psychological disciplines.
This is off record, but perhaps maybe one day you could be my external reader.
That's another.
Okay. So anyway, back to the story. Which books are you working on now? Are you writing a specific book or several?
Well, my main task is finishing the editing of the black books.
I know that the want for them, the need for them, is tremendous. So I think that everybody is looking forward to that. Can you talk a little bit about your background? Where did you start off, and how did you get into Jung? When did you start reading him, and how did you become so proficient?
Proficiency simply through study. I began reading Jung in my teens. First text I read was Commentary on the Secret of the Golden Flower, which at that stage looked like offering a point of mediation between East and West. And so that was what interested me both in Jung and in psychology. I then began to feel that the field of psychology was in a mess and became more interested in studying the history of psychology, looking at how psychologies are formed and put together. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
And what is your current connection and relations with the Jung family?
I'm general editor of the Philemon Foundation, which has been dedicated to raising funds for preparing for publication the unpublished works of C.G. Jung, and it works in close collaboration with the Foundation for the Works of C.G. Jung.
I'm wondering if there are any works that have not been published where Jung and Freud collaborated, and also has he ever addressed the metaphysical realm as he was interested in his mother's behavior to a level where he would agree that it exists and be open to discussing it, or has he written anything about it that's not been published?
There's nothing in regard to Jung's collaboration with Freud that is of significance that's not published. In regard to Jung's own works, there are hundreds of manuscripts. I'm not exaggerating numerically, that are unpublished, and also thousands of letters. Now, to this date, I don't think anyone has actually read through all of the correspondence. So it's fair enough to say we simply don't. We have some sense of the extent and scale of the unpublished corpus, but full correspondences, for instance, simply haven't been studied. Don't actually know what might be still in some of them. I presented, I would say, the results of the first extensive study of the unpublished corpus I drew on in the first volume of my book, Jung and the Making of Modern Psychology, The Dream of a Science, and I've been trying to both study Jung in an integrated manner, i.e. drawing as much on the published and unpublished corpus, as well as try to facilitate the editing for publication and proper historical editions of as much of that as possible. And other editors in the Philemon Foundation I think have done superb work with the editions they've produced.
Depth psychology is what I'm studying, and Jungian psychology and depth psychology are one and the same in a way. Compared to current day psychology, I believe that depth psychology is the future because it allows for true transformation, not reliant necessarily on medications and behavior therapy, but really on digging deep, working with dreams. And I was just wondering, how do you feel about Jungian and depth psychology as the future of psychology?
In the case of Jungian psychology, I've written that I actually don't think Jungian psychology in the singular as a unitary discipline exists anymore. I think there are a plethora of Jungian psychologies in the plural which have contingent rather than necessary connections to Jung and to each other, and that they each have to be evaluated on their own terms. In many ways, I think that it would be very valuable to have what one could call an anthropology of psychology, to actually look at how psychologies function in the contemporary world. But my own interests have been more historical in terms of understanding how they came to be formed in their genesis.
Now, the transcendent function was supposedly, it was James Hillman who requested Jung he needed some new information to be written about. And so in 1958, Jung took the 1916 version and revised it. Can you describe the transcendent function and its history?
It's a paper that Jung wrote in 1916, and it's important to note that he wasn't terribly happy with it, just put it to one side. The version that got published, I think it was in 1958, is a very light revision. There's not a massive change between that, and Jung added a short prefatory note indicating that this was something that was of historical interest. But it's clear that the concept or the term plays a critical role in Jung's work. For instance, as to use one of the cognate terms used in 1921 in psychological types, namely the reconciling symbol, i.e. the reconciling symbol that resolved the conflict of opposites. And that's a theme and a motif, how to resolve the problem of opposites, and how this can be done through in a symbolic form that runs, you could say, right throughout his work up to Mysterium Conjunctionis.
Those two are rather similar in their transformative alchemical function of the magical third.
Well, the motif, the problematic of how to resolve the conflict of opposites
Continues.
Yeah, that's what Jung was attempting
It almost
to do.
started with the transcendent function, ended with
the transcendent function is one attempt at a theoretical description of what the problem was and how a symbol could provide resolution of that conflict.
In my upcoming presentation, I discuss how during the moment of conception, when the egg and the sperm meet, there's an electrical charge which creates the third. And I was wondering if that's a good example, and how you feel about that electrical charge in general as it relates to the world.
That sounds to me more like a metaphorical extrapolation.
Okay.
Because what Jung was talking about was on the psychic level.
Okay. The next question I have for you is, there's schools in this world, such as Pacifica, that deal specifically with depth and Jungian psychology. There aren't that many of them in general. Can you summarize, if you feel like it needs to be more clear, do we need more such educational facilities, and what's the best way to implement that in the world?
My interests are in the historical study of Jung, and I would say that I think that Jung has had a presence that has been much larger than people have sometimes portrayed it in the academic world, but it's been dispersed in various departments. In one place, for instance, where there's traditionally been an ongoing and active interest in Jung is in the field of religious studies and comparative religion.
There are people who consider Jung theoretical, non-scientific, metaphysical. What would you say to them?
The many designations that have been placed on Jung. My interest is understanding or tracking the reception of his work. In the case of the issue of science, it seems to me, if you look at the history of psychology, the only one constant thing is that psychologists felt that it was up to them to decide what constituted science in psychology. And there was not a consensus among psychologists. So, and the term science today is symbolically laden in contemporary societies. So my interest there was tracking down, okay, how does Jung use the word science? What does he mean by that? How to track the signifier science in his works, and to look at how that operated. What he was attempting to do then was quite clearly to resolve or reconcile a split between science and religion that had occurred around about the time of what used to be called the scientific revolution. That's what he saw in one way as part of his historical task.
How can we make depth psychology scientific or appreciated by the APA, etc.?
The first question you have to ask is, why would you want to do that? In the sense that you then have to look at whatever the criteria are in terms of what are the operational categories that are being employed, and is that an appropriate task in the sense of, in terms of whatever the research modalities you're interested in pursuing, can it be made to fit those boxes without remainder? It's not I can't answer that question. It's a question of for others to decide.
When you write essays, do you use APA or do you use a different format?
I would use whatever format is used by the publisher or the journal I'm writing with. I prefer to use full historical. Prefer to use footnotes and full historical references.
When you finish many manuscripts, do you have editors who come in and fine-tune everything, or do you do all the work yourself?
I do the work myself. Whenever you publish your work, you will deal with copy editors at the publishers.
And lastly, for students, PhD candidates, and others, what would be your advice for them to succeed in a field that is somewhat ambiguous?
I wouldn't know what. I can't think. I don't have any generic advice other than to stay close to one's passions that have led one to a field in the first place, and to pursue that with rigor and integrity.
Great. It's been a true pleasure speaking with Professor Sonu Shamdasani. We look forward to the Black Books, and again, we thank you for your time.
Thanks.